Uncharted territories. Welcome to humanity's checkerboard crisis. Are our leaders playing checkers while the world burns in a game of Go?
Wow. Digging into all this stuff has been quite a journey. The sources you've brought to the table, I mean, they really paint a picture of a world grappling with some pretty serious challenges ahead.
Yeah, no doubt.
We've got a Go Master's strategic outlook for the next 5 years, some pretty stark predictions about global flashpoints by 2030, a breakdown of what actually makes a strategic thinker, and even this really interesting attempt to, quantify humanity's capacity for strategic thinking, you know?
Totally.
It feels like we're looking at this whole global landscape through a totally different, more strategic lens. It's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. I think what's really powerful is when you start to see these different threads, these perspectives kind of weaving together, is this sort of underlying metaphor emerges. It's like the world is this incredibly complex game of Go.
Right.
And it requires that long-term thinking, that real understanding of the interconnectedness of everything.
Yeah.
It's not like checkers. It's not those simple moves. It's much more nuanced.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the mission of this deep dive, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to synthesize these critical insights from all these sources and hopefully give you, the listener, a more profound understanding of the challenges, but also the kind of strategic thinking we need to navigate them.
Okay, so let's dive right in, starting with the Go Masters analysis of these potential global flashpoints, these major challenges heading our way between now and 2030. What really jumped out at you from that assessment?
Well, I mean, when you think about it from the perspective of this Go Master, they're kind of surveying the board. What they see is this concerning trajectory, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's across multiple domains. But there's this pattern of escalating instability that kind of keeps popping up.
Very interesting.
Take climate and environmental breakdown, for instance. The forecast, just looking at the near term, 2025 to 2027, it's pointing to a really significant uptick in severe weather events.
Got it.
We're talking more intense storms, droughts, floods. This is leading to widespread infrastructure damage, and obviously the pressure of sea level rise just keeps going.
Right.
But I think what's even more worrying are the cascading effects.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not just about the immediate disaster itself. It's everything that comes after.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head there. And when you look a little bit further out, 2027 to 2030, the analysis really anticipates this acceleration of climate-driven migration and a really sharp decline in global food security.
Okay. Wow.
So we're not just talking about an environmental problem anymore.
Yeah.
This is a full-blown humanitarian crisis brewing.
Yeah.
And there's a potential for, these massive climate refugee waves that could really destabilize, like Southern Europe, North America, Asia.
Wow.
And then you add to that the increasing scarcity of freshwater resources. You've got potential flashpoints in regions that are already under a lot of stress.
Yep.
We're talking about India, Pakistan, the Nile Basin, with Ethiopia and Egypt, China, and Southeast Asia. It's almost like climate change becomes this threat multiplier, right?
Yeah.
It takes all these existing vulnerabilities and just throws gasoline on the fire.
It seems like that interconnectedness, that's like a recurring theme here, right?
Yeah, for sure.
What about the geopolitical landscape? I mean, things already feel pretty tense out there. What does the Go Master see happening there?
Well, the assessment definitely reflects that tension you're talking about.
Okay.
In the immediate future, again, 2025 to 2027, we should expect to see even more tension around those hotspots we're already familiar with, right?
Yeah.
Taiwan, the South China Sea, Ukraine, Iran. These are places that are just constantly on edge. But what's really interesting is that the projection for 2027 to 2030 shows this rise of proxy conflicts between the major powers.
Okay.
So think U.S., China, Russia, right?
Yeah.
They're competing for resources. They're competing for influence. So maybe less direct confrontation between these big players. But more of these battles fought indirectly through other actors.
Which, in a way, could be even more insidious, right?
Yeah.
Because it's harder to control.
Exactly. It's like the shadow war playing out.
So in this kind of scenario, what are the potential flashpoints?
Well, the analysis really highlights the possibility of a direct or a proxy conflict over Taiwan. And that could be a major catalyst for a global economic crisis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Taiwan plays such a crucial role in semiconductor manufacturing and global trade.
Yeah.
If something were to happen there, the ripple effects would be huge.
Massive.
And then you've got the increasing militarization of the Arctic,
Oh, right.
driven
Yeah.
by these new shipping routes that are opening up, untapped resources, all of that. It's becoming a very contested space.
Yeah.
And that could easily become another source of multinational tension, like really quickly.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the economic forecasts. It sounds like we might be in for a bit of a bumpy ride, economically speaking.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. The near-term picture,
Hmm.
2025 to 2027, suggests we're going to see persistently high inflation, slowing economic growth, and there's this growing sovereign debt crisis in a lot of nations. But the real concern, I think, emerges further down the line. In that 2027 and 2030 window,
Yeah.
there's potential for a significant global economic depression.
Oh, wow.
And this could be following a major financial crash, which could be triggered by, widespread debt defaults, and also a surge in this idea of economic nationalism.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit. What exactly does economic nationalism mean in this context?
It essentially means countries are going to start prioritizing their own interests, right?
Okay.
Maybe at the expense of global cooperation.
So sort of a fracturing of global trade, more protectionist policies, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Everyone's going to be looking out for number one, and that could have some pretty dire consequences.
Yeah, I can see how that would lead to problems. So by 2030, what are we looking at in terms of flashpoints, economically speaking?
The analysis points to a severe weakening of global trade, which would obviously make those recessionary pressures even worse, right?
Right.
And then you've got significant economic destabilization in developing nations, potentially leading to widespread poverty, unrest, and you guessed it, mass migration.
It all sounds incredibly interconnected.
Yeah, that's the thing about all these global challenges, right? It's like a giant web. You pull on one strand and the whole thing starts to shake.
Okay, so we've got climate change, geopolitical tensions, economic instability, and then, of course, there's the whole world of technology and cybersecurity to consider. How does that factor into this Go board?
Yeah, that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
The Go Masters analysis really flags this increase in AI-driven disinformation campaigns and these really disruptive cyber attacks, targeting infrastructure. That's a key threat, especially between 2025 and 2027. And then looking further out to that 2027 to 2030 period, there's serious concern about a successful cyber terror attack.
Okay.
I mean, imagine a scenario where critical infrastructure in a major economy is just disabled. We're talking power grids, financial networks, essential services, just completely shut down.
That's a pretty terrifying thought. What could that potentially lead to by 2030?
Well, the analysis suggests it could lead to a complete collapse of trust in digital infrastructure itself.
Oh.
So you could have this global digital governance crisis, a fragmentation of the internet, this splinternet idea that people have been talking about, different regions operating under
Right.
completely different digital rules.
Right. Yeah.
It would be chaos.
Shifting gears again, let's talk about the societal level. It feels like in a lot of parts of the world, trust in institutions is already pretty fragile. How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, you're right. The analysis definitely supports that feeling. It points to this continued erosion of trust, both in institutions and in mainstream media, especially between 2025 and 2027.
Got it.
And that's fueled by this, constant flood of misinformation and this increasing polarization that we see in societies everywhere.
Yeah.
And then when you get to that 2027 to 2030 period, the concern becomes widespread social unrest.
Okay.
It's driven by inequality, by the impact of disinformation, declining living standards. This is where you start to see those extremist ideologies taking hold, authoritarian movements gaining traction.
So there's a real possibility of seeing significant internal conflict and instability within nations, not just between them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a major concern. The potential flashpoints by 2030 include increased civil unrest, even political violence in major democracies. And, authoritarian regimes, they're going to be ready to exploit that instability, to tighten their grip, to erode human rights.
And then, of course, we have the ever-present threat of global health crises.
Yeah.
Pandemics, antibiotic resistance, those sorts of things.
Right, and the analysis anticipates the emergence of novel zoonotic diseases, even in the near term, between 2025 and 2027. It's driven by things like climate change, habitat destruction,
Right.
And then when you look at 2027 to 2030, there's this really big worry about a pandemic that's even worse than COVID-19.
Oh, wow.
higher transmissibility, higher mortality rates, and to make things even worse, this growing crisis of antibiotic resistance. It's a really dangerous combination.
That would be devastating for global health systems, for everything.
Exactly. And that's why a potential flashpoint for 2030 is the actual collapse of healthcare systems
Right.
in multiple regions.
Oh, wow.
They're just completely overwhelmed by these public health crises. And that leads to, immense economic hardship, social upheaval. It just creates this whole downward spiral.
So painting the picture here, this Go Masters assessment, it's not exactly optimistic.
No, it's not.
It really sounds like we're on this path toward significant global instability unless something drastically changes.
Yeah, that's really the core takeaway here. The analysis is suggesting that without some kind of coordinated global action, we're on this trajectory towards a breakdown.
Right.
It's a cascading breakdown where all of these challenges, they start feeding off of each other, making each other worse.
But the analysis does touch on this idea of, potential shock events, right?
Events that might actually be so big, so disruptive, that they actually force global action.
Yeah, it's kind of like sometimes it takes a real crisis to make everyone wake up and work together.
Exactly. It's unfortunate, but it seems like that's often how it works.
Yeah. And the analysis points to a few of these potential catalysts.
Boy.
It could be a severe global climate shock event, something that's just so undeniable, so catastrophic that it forces everyone's hand.
Right.
Or it could be a major geopolitical trigger, like a direct conflict over Taiwan, something that really shakes up the global order.
Or a massive cyber attack that cripples global financial systems.
Right, that would definitely get everyone's attention. Or, another pandemic, but this time even more devastating than what we've already experienced.
It's almost like the world needs a wake-up call, and these are the potential alarm clocks, right?
That's a good way to put it. It's not a pleasant thought, but it's a reality we have to consider. Let's pivot a bit now and talk about another really fascinating aspect of the material you shared. This hypothetical scenario where the U.S. significantly withdraws from the global stage. If that were to happen, how would that reshape the global go board?
Well, this is a crucial what-if scenario to think about. And the analysis really suggests that a major U.S. withdrawal would have these huge destabilizing consequences around the world. It's essentially creating a power vacuum and inviting other actors to step in, which could lead to all sorts of unpredictable shifts in the global balance of power.
Okay, so let's break it down by region. What would a U.S. withdrawal mean for Europe, for example?
Well, in Europe, the analysis indicates a much higher likelihood of Russian assertiveness.
I see.
We might see an escalation of hybrid warfare tactics against the Baltic states, against Poland, maybe even limited military incursions.
Wow.
And the overall risk of a direct conflict between Russia and NATO would go way up, especially since Europe still relies heavily on U.S. military capabilities. Institutions like the IS have been pointing this out for a while.
So basically, a diminished U.S. presence would embolden Russia to be more aggressive and potentially even take military action.
Exactly. It's like taking the brakes off. And it's not just Europe. If we look at the Asia-Pacific, the risks are equally serious.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, the likelihood of China making a move on Taiwan, whether it's a blockade or a full-scale invasion, would skyrocket.
Wow.
And China would likely solidify its control over the South China Sea. We'd probably see increased aggression from North Korea and a regional arms race as countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia try to build up their defenses.
Makes sense. It's a very volatile region.
It is. And the analysis also points to China's increasing use of what they call gray zone tactics. These are actions that are below the threshold of traditional warfare, things like economic coercion, maritime harassment.
Okay.
And that kind of activity could escalate significantly if the U.S. isn't there to push back. Chatham House has done some great work on this.
So a U.S. withdrawal would basically give China more room to maneuver in the region?
Exactly. And then you have the Middle East, which is already such a complex and often volatile region.
Right.
The analysis suggests that a U.S. pullback there would likely intensify the proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it would lower the threshold for direct conflict between Iran and Israel.
Oh, wow.
You'd also probably see increased assertiveness from Turkey as a regional power, and potentially even a resurgence of extremist groups like ISIS. Think tanks like the Rosanna Center have been tracking these trends, and they're really concerning.
It's like every region have its own set of potential powder kegs, and a U.S. withdrawal would be like lighting a match near them.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And then there's Africa, which sometimes gets overlooked in these global power discussions.
Right.
But a significant U.S. withdrawal would likely worsen existing conflicts in places like the Sahel and the Horn of Africa.
Okay.
Because there would be less U.S. counterterrorism support, less security assistance. And then you'd have increased competition for resources from external powers like Russia, China, Turkey, and various Gulf states. It could lead to more state collapses, more humanitarian crises. There's been a lot of discussion about the risks of dependency in regions like the G5 Sahel, and those concerns would become even more acute.
So it's a pretty bleak picture across the board. What about the broader global implications? If the U.S. steps back, what happens to the overall system?
Well, on a systemic level, the analysis predicts a rise in nuclear proliferation as nations feel less secure and start looking for ways to protect themselves. We'd likely see a weakening of international norms and more of those smaller-scale conflicts popping up as the global order becomes less stable.
So it's not just about specific regions, it's about the whole fabric of international relations fraying.
Exactly. The Go Master's warning here is pretty stark. A U.S. withdrawal would likely invite widespread chaos and a cascade of simultaneous conflicts all over the world.
That's a sobering thought. And it brings us to a really crucial question. Who are the individuals who might be capable of navigating this incredibly complex and dangerous landscape? The material you shared actually includes this fascinating set of criteria for identifying these potential go masters, the people who think strategically on a national or even global level. What are some of those key characteristics?
Well, the criteria they lay out, it's really insightful. It helps us understand what true strategic mastery really means in this context.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, raw intelligence or holding a powerful position.
Right.
It goes way beyond that. It's about strategic foresight, being able to anticipate those long-term consequences. It's about systems-level thinking, understanding how everything is interconnected, how one action can trigger all these ripple effects.
That's crucial.
It is. And it's also about having interdisciplinary expertise. You need to be able to draw insights from different fields, not just be stuck in one silo. And then you need an adaptive and flexible mindset because things are going to change constantly and you have to be able to adjust your strategy on the fly.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, you need really effective communication and influence skills.
Yeah, because it's not enough to just have brilliant ideas.
Exactly. You have to be able to translate those ideas into real-world impact, to bring other people along, to build consensus.
It's about leadership as much as it is about intellect.
Absolutely. And the criteria also emphasize a few other things. You need a track record of tangible results.
Okay.
You need a strong ethical compass, integrity in leadership, global and cross-cultural sensitivity, because you're dealing with a diverse world, right?
Yeah.
And you need the courage and decisiveness to act, even when things are uncertain, when the stakes are high.
So it's about having the vision, but also the guts to follow through.
Exactly. And then, on top of all that, you need the ability to build alliances and coalitions. Nobody can solve these global challenges alone.
That's so true.
You need a learning orientation, a willingness to constantly adapt and evolve.
All right.
And ideally, you've got recognition from your peers, people who see you as a strategic thinker, someone they trust and respect.
It's a pretty tall order, isn't it?
It is. And the analysis acknowledges that finding individuals who embody all of these traits is incredibly difficult.
Right.
Especially in the world we live in today, with the 24/7 news cycle, the constant noise of social media. It's all about instant reaction sound bites. And that doesn't exactly lend itself to deep, long-term strategic thinking.
It's hard to find those quiet, thoughtful voices in all the noise.
Exactly. So the analysis suggests that we need to look beyond the obvious public figures, the people who are constantly in the spotlight. We need to explore those less conventional spaces, like niche online forums where people are having in-depth discussions, high-quality newsletters that provide nuanced analysis, academic preprint servers, specialized think tanks, those kinds of places.
So it's not necessarily about the loudest voices, but the most thoughtful ones?
Exactly. The people who are really grappling with these complex issues, who are thinking about the long game.
And the analysis actually offered some interesting archetypes or types of potential go masters that we might look for. Can you tell me more about those?
Yeah, they described a few different types. There's the synthesizer, someone who's really good at connecting seemingly disparate ideas and trends, seeing the patterns that other people miss.
Oh, interesting.
And then there's the bridge builder, an individual who can effectively link different fields of knowledge or connect different communities of practice.
Okay, I see.
Then you've got the quiet network weaver, someone who's working behind the scenes, building those crucial relationships and fostering shared understanding.
Unsung heroes.
Exactly. And then there's the local systems innovator, someone who's actually implementing solutions at a smaller scale, but in a way that could potentially be scaled up to address these big global challenges.
So it's not just about thinking globally, it's also about acting locally.
Right. You need both.
Hmm.
And the analysis actually went a step further and named some individuals who might exhibit some of these indicators. But of course, they acknowledged that it's really difficult to draw firm conclusions based solely on publicly available information.
Yeah, that's fair. So who made it onto that list?
Well, some of the names that were mentioned included Yuval Noah Harari for his ability to synthesize these broad historical trends and think about the future in really interesting ways. And then in the field of AI, they highlighted Demis Hassabis and Dario Amodei because they're really focused on the long-term safety and societal implications of advanced artificial intelligence.
Okay.
They're thinking about the big picture, not just the next cool algorithm.
It's about responsible innovation, right?
Exactly. And then there's Christine Lagarde, who's obviously been navigating the complexities of the global financial system for years.
Right.
And then Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, who's constantly trying to raise awareness about these interconnected global challenges. And then you've got Bill Gates, who's been incredibly influential in global health and development initiatives for decades.
It's a pretty impressive list.
It is. And it wasn't just the big names either.
Okay.
They also mentioned people like Lucy Blakiston, who does a great job of explaining complex global news to a wider audience, especially younger generations.
I see.
And Joan LaRovere, who's using data science to try to improve global healthcare delivery, and Dana Klisanen, who's taking this really transdisciplinary approach to addressing the interconnected challenges of mental health and climate change.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is. And then there's Marlena Lim, who's doing some really important research on the complex relationship between technology and society.
Right.
And of course, you can't forget about the whole generation of Gen Z climate activists who are pushing for systemic change with a really clear long-term vision.
Yeah, they're definitely a force to be reckoned with.
They are. And the list went on to include people like Audrey Tang in Taiwan, Mariana Mazzucato, Akim Steiner at the UNDP, Timnit Gebru, Jennifer Doudna, Catherine Heo, Vitalik Buterin, Zhang Yiming, Julie Zhu, Zeynep Tufekci, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Nora Bateson, Karen Levy, Hannah Ritchie, Ida Auken, and Deb Roy. Each of them was mentioned in connection with specific indicators of strategic thinking that they seem to demonstrate in their work.
It's a really diverse group of people spanning all sorts of fields and approaches. It's inspiring to see that there are people out there who are really thinking about these challenges in such a deep and thoughtful way. Finally, the material you shared really delved into the human capacity for strategic mastery from a more quantitative perspective. It even tried to measure it and then explore potential ways to accelerate its development.
Yeah, that was one of the most thought-provoking parts of the analysis. They attempted to estimate how strategic thinking capacity is distributed within the global population.
Okay.
And it suggested that only a tiny percentage, something like 0.0003%, are currently operating as fully realized Go Masters.
Wow, that's a really small number.
It is. But the good news is they believe that a much larger portion of the population, maybe 0.5 to 1%, has high latent potential. And an even larger segment has moderate or developmental capacity.
So the potential is there, just needs to be unlocked.
Exactly. But they also pointed out that this distribution isn't uniform across different cultures and regions.
Okay.
Factors like education systems, cultural thinking patterns, institutional opportunities, and even things like gender disparities, all of those things can influence how this inherent potential is realized.
It makes sense that different environments would foster strategic thinking to different degrees.
Right. And they also discussed the developmental trajectory of strategic thinking. There are these critical learning periods, and it can be really difficult to transfer skills you've learned in one area to another. It's not always a straightforward process.
So it's complex. It's not just about teaching people how to think strategically. It's about creating the right conditions for that kind of thinking to flourish.
Exactly. And the analysis actually proposed a really interesting intervention, something they believe could have a huge impact.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
They call it transdisciplinary decision simulators with accelerated feedback loops.
Okay, that sounds pretty high-tech. Break down for me. What exactly are we talking about here?
Essentially, they're talking about creating these sophisticated environments, probably using technology, where people can engage with these complex, interconnected problems but in a compressed time frame.
I see.
They get to see the consequences of their decisions play out across multiple domains, and they get immediate feedback on their choices.
So it's like a flight simulator, but for navigating global challenges.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. The idea is to take these vast time horizons and compress them into manageable learning experiences. You integrate knowledge from all these different fields, you provide really rapid and meaningful feedback, and you scale it all up through technology.
It's about learning by doing, but in a safe and controlled environment where you can experiment and make mistakes without causing real-world harm.
That's the idea. And the analysis suggested a few ways to deploy these simulators effectively.
Okay.
Leverage existing infrastructure, like universities and leadership programs. Use open source principles so everyone can benefit. Target those key populations with high potential. Embed the simulations directly into decision-making processes. And even make it competitive, to really engage people and motivate them to excel.
It's about making it fun, making it engaging, making it something people want to do.
Right. And they were actually quite optimistic about the potential impact. They suggested that we could double the number of strategic masters within 5 to 7 years.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is. And they also believe that we could significantly elevate the baseline strategic capacity across a much broader segment of the population.
So it's not just about creating a few more brilliant minds, it's about raising the overall level of strategic thinking.
Exactly. And of course, they acknowledged that these simulators would be even more effective if they were combined with other efforts. Things like broader educational reforms, institutional changes that prioritize strategic thinking, improvements to the information environment, and really promoting diversity of perspective in decision-making.
It's about creating a whole ecosystem that supports strategic thinking.
That's right.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. It really feels like the core message woven throughout all this material is that we desperately need more people who can think strategically, who can see the big picture, who can think long-term, if we want to have any hope of navigating the future successfully.
Absolutely. And understanding these potential flashpoints and understanding the qualities of those strategic thinkers, it's not just an intellectual exercise, right?
Right.
It can empower you, the listener, to really understand the forces that are shaping our world.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, you can start contributing to more thoughtful, more strategic decision-making in your own life, in your community, in your work.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to consider. Given all the complex challenges we've talked about, what role can you play in fostering more long-term systems-level thinking?
Yeah.
What strategic stones can you place on that global go board that might help create a more stable, a more resilient, a more positive future?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves.
We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, these individuals, these concepts. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
You've been listening to Uncharted Territories, where human curiosity meets AI capability. This episode was a creation of the AI Plus Roundtable, blending insights from the human producers at Innovation Toronto, with analysis co-developed using powerful AI capabilities, tapping heavily into models such as ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, with support and contributions from a wide range of other AIs. Our main AI hosts are voiced by Notebook LM, along with additional voice contributions from Microsoft. A sincere thank you to everyone involved in this unique human-AI partnership. Continue exploring with us on Substack at airoad.substack.com for show notes, further reading, and more content. That's airoad.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in to this AI Plus Roundtable production. We hope you'll join us again as we continue charting the territory where human creativity and AI capability converge.